in New York, where Wall Street took another dive today. The Dow fell roughly 2,200 points, about 5%.
Thursday's losses making this the worst two-day streak for the market since the early days of the COVID pandemic.
North American stock markets have just closed after a brutal day of trading. They took a massive tumble.
President Trump says the markets are going to boom.
In the intricate world of finance, a single moment of emotion or information can turn everything upside down. Such was the case on a day that will forever be etched in the annals of American stock market history. A day when over $3.1 trillion vanished from Wall Street in just a few hours. All three major U.S. stock indices closed with their worst losses since the pandemic-stricken month of June 2020. This seismic market crash, which some are calling Independence Day, was spurred by a protectionist policy aimed at shielding American manufacturers. Instead, it triggered a widespread collapse across all indices, from the Dow Jones and S&P 500 to the tech-laden Nasdaq, shaking the very foundations of the global financial system. With sweeping tariffs targeting nearly every sector, from automotive and energy to software and agriculture, the world now finds itself staring down the barrel of an all-out trade war. This raises urgent questions. What does the so-called Independence Day truly signify? What impact will the Trump administration's bold protectionist stance have on American households and corporate profits? And is the unprecedented $3.1 trillion market loss merely the beginning of a much deeper crisis? On April 2nd, 2025, the United States, long considered the cradle of global innovation, finance, and technology, unleashed a storm upon the World Trade Order by imposing a fresh wave of tariffs. The White House hailed it as a step toward liberating American industry from foreign competition. But as markets opened on April 3rd, the mood was anything but celebratory. Investors witnessed a meltdown of historic proportions. Panic swept across trading floors as major U.S. corporations, including Apple, IBM, and Tesla, suffered staggering losses. Apple, in particular, felt the heat, with its supply chains deeply embedded in China. The new tariffs drastically raised its production costs. In a rare public statement, Apple's executives voiced concern, warning that the tariffs not only threatened jobs, but also endangered the company's ability to maintain supply and pricing. The broader market sentiment was one of dread. The S&P 500 plunged nearly 5%, erasing almost $2 trillion in value, while the Dow Jones shed 4% and the Nasdaq collapsed by 6%. Retail stocks suffered especially brutal losses. Nike fell 14.5%, Lululemon dropped 10%, and Ralph Lauren plummeted 16%. The U.S. dollar weakened by over 2%, reaching a 6-month low, while oil prices tumbled nearly 7%, driven by fears of an impending global slowdown. Even overseas markets reacted. Japan's Nikkei 225 slipped 2.7%, Australia's ASX 200 dropped 1.6%, and South Korea's Kospi hovered slightly lower. In contrast, Chinese and Hong Kong markets remained closed for the Qingming Festival. Amid this chaos, recession fears took hold. J.P. Morgan raised the probability of a U.S. recession to 60%. Analysts argued that these protectionist measures could suffocate growth and trigger inflation. Financial forecasts for companies like Apple became increasingly bleak, with projected cost increases of up to 10%, potentially wiping out over $350 billion in market value. President Trump, however, remained defiant. The markets are going to explode, he said optimistically, insisting the tariffs would spark a manufacturing revival. He left the door open for future negotiations, but made no indication of rolling back the current measures. Global leaders, however, were not as optimistic. France's President Emmanuel Macron hinted at retaliation against U.S. tech firms, while Canada vowed to impose its own 25% auto tariffs. Analysts warned that European GDP could take a 1% hit, with retaliatory measures only deepening the economic damage. Despite assurances from Trump and his trade minister, many U.S. business leaders voiced concern. A coalition of major corporations, including J.P. Morgan, IBM, and Apple, pleaded for the tariffs to be withdrawn. The National Retail Federation warned of rising costs for everyday Americans, and the National Association of Manufacturers declared the move a direct threat to investment, jobs, and competitiveness. Polls echoed this discontent. Only 28% of Americans supported the tariffs, while 58% believed they would harm the economy. Yet Trump remained unfazed, framing the backlash as a noise of globalists, special interests, and fake news. He promised that America would soon be something the whole world will be talking about. This unprecedented shift in U.S. trade policy has cast a long shadow over financial markets and raised doubts about the future of global economic stability. For decades, the U.S. has been the engine of global consumption, buying goods from across the world at relatively low prices. Now, with that model under siege, analysts warn that reversing course could come at a steep cost, including higher prices, reduced wages, and a global recession. Trump's belief in tariffs is rooted in decades-old convictions that they will spark domestic growth, increase tax revenue, and reduce trade deficits. But as the dust settles, the reality is stark. America's gamble on economic isolation may come profound and lasting consequences for Wall Street, for Main Street, and for the world. Thank you for tuning in.